Chapter 6. Ancient Midnight. Brox awoke in the large bed provided for him in Cloak Toff's manor. Similar to the morning before at the Big Bowl, he just stayed in the bed, staring. Unlike his morning at the Big Bowl, he did not stare out the window. Instead, he fixed his gaze on a bar of soap resting on the table across the room. Last night he had used a bar of soap to wash his face and hands. That bar of soap had been carved into the shape of a phoenix. He now saw a new bar of soap. The brownies had carved a bar of soap to look like him, complete with spectacles, his cape with the unicorn clasp, a sledgehammer in one hand, and a wooden flagon-filled berry budge in the other. Brox turned over in his mind how the dwarfs and two tools often accuse the gnomes as wasting time on frivolous projects. They probably have not met many brownies who carve bars of soap. Brox's eyes wandered over to the basin of water, watching the wisps of steam rise from it. He did not know when the brownies brought in the hot water, but they had used stealth. To do acts of generosity without being noticed tended to be a characteristic of the tiny people. Last evening, Brox saw several of the brownies frolicking under the branches of a massive weeping willow. Tralinda had told him that there were 14 members of the Broomsticks clan still living at the manor. When he had asked if he could see where they actually lived in the manor, she had only smiled and shook her head no. Brox had not been surprised, since brownies kept their living quarters a secret. Only careful observation would ever turn up such a place. Brox got out of the bed, pulling off the nightcap that he wore, a dark blue nightcap with a copper-colored tassel at the top. Brox had never worn a nightcap before, but the brownies had made one especially for him and had placed it on his pillow for use. Brownies wore one when they slept and, therefore, took it for granted that everyone else did, too. Brox considered making the bed, but he knew that all of the bedding would be stripped, washed, and replaced by the tiny people. He heard a soft knock at the door. Enter. No one came in, therefore the gnome went to the door and opened it. On a small three-legged table, there rested a polished silver tray containing 2 boiled eggs, a salt bowl for the eggs, toast, 3 jars of jams, peach, raspberry, and pine mint, and coffee with cream and sugar already added. He looked for his benefactors, knowing that he would never find them. He took the tray of food and returned to his room to prepare for the day. An hour later, Brox found himself standing next to the time shifter, the very object he had wanted to spend a decade taking apart in order to understand its true function. That proved no longer necessary, for he knew that the purpose of the time machine that Cloak Toff had constructed had been to study events in different ages. Do you know how to make the time shifter work? Tralinda had been escorting Brox all morning, asking questions about his plans, blinking constantly. Gnomes, by nature, understand the working of mechanics to the point that they could easily be labeled artificers from childhood. Now that Brox understood the nature of the device and had an outline from Cloak Toff on how to set the device in motion, he could answer the question with reasonable confidence. I believe so. He pointed to a pair of dials with white wheels and copper symbols and numbers. This set of dials sets the date, and this set selects the location. He touched one of the 9 brass handles. These handles regulate the energy flow. They are connected to these 4 delator rods. Brox did not say anything, but he knew that one marginal error in controlling these could lead to a time displacement mistake, resulting in missing the desired time frame. If the desired time frame failed to be reached, then the time shifter would be pulled back to the present, costing the time traveler weeks as the machine underwent recharging, recalibration, and repair, since it always took damage to its superstructure in its time flights. Of course, there always existed the chance of the machine ripping apart due to an error, scattering the remains of the user across the ages. After reviewing back fluxes, dilation weavers, and the 2 spindle mounts, Brox climbed into the time shifter's spherical cage, strapping himself in with a series of wide leather belts, the machine's safety harness. After double-checking his straps, he looked over to Tralinda to thank her for all her help. He was surprised to see every member of the Broomsticks clan standing there. All of the men and boys had their hats in both of their hands, holding them over their hearts. The women and girls showed signs of wanting to cry, and 2 of them even had tears rolling down their cheeks. Tralinda. Brox fixed his gaze on the brownie, speaking with a mellifluous voice. What is this all about? Tralinda blinked, a single tear forming at the side of her eye and rolling slowly down her cheek. They are here to wish you well. That's why they are crying? She shook her head. No. During the last use of the time shifter, we lost Cloak Toff. For over a century, the Broomstick clan has served no one. You showed up and gave us purpose to use our domestic magic. Many fear that this will be the end of you, as it was the end of the Chronomancer. When you are in the cage, and the time shifter is operating, you are helpless. It was during this time of vulnerability that Cloak Toff was slain. They fear for your safety. In other words, they are crying over your possible loss. Brox glanced around and noticed that not only did the men have their hats in their hands, they each had a small cook's knife hidden in the folds of their hats. Moreover, each woman had a rolling pin. Do they plan to fight with those? Asked Brox. If the creatures of darkness show up, then yes. Brox felt deeply impressed that they were willing to do such a thing. Yet, he also knew that they would have little chance against a horde of skeletons and zombies. You don't need to do that. It would be best if you all hid yourselves and watched over one another. She smiled. We will do what we have to do. She then winked at him and nodded to the left. Brox followed her line of sight, resting his eyes on the clay golem. I thought that he belonged in the museum. Assuredly, that is true. We are not sure how old the construct is. We have to fix it up from time to time with mud and wax, but we think it is about 3, perhaps 4, centuries old. Nevertheless, the clay golem can still fight. Brox nodded. He turned his attention back to the gathering of brownies, trying to think of something to say. Tralinda spoke. Our best goes out to you. All the brownies, except Tralinda, began to scatter. As they began to move, many of them turned invisible, capitalizing on one of their natural abilities. Where are they going? Asked Brox. It is dangerous to be in the rotunda when the time shifter first activates. She blinked. I do hope that you return to us. She blew him a kiss. Then, walking over to the old clay golem, she led the construct out of the rotunda, leaving Brox alone. After watching a distant door close behind the two, Brox felt a tinge of sorrow for reasons that he could not explain. He shook his head and focused on the time shifter. Are you sure that you want to do this, Brox? The gnome spoke to himself, reflecting upon the uncertainty of the situation. After a moment of internal debate, he said, all right, then punch the back fluxer, make the time shifter function, and your journey to the past will begin. Before he could reconsider his actions, he activated the magical device, sealing his fate. Brox had never talked to anyone who had experienced time travel. Therefore, he had no idea what to expect. He closed his eyes as a flash of blinding green lightning emanated from the simultaneous discharge of 256 hidden energy nodes. There followed a resonating sound that reminded Brox of the clangor that came from the ancient bell in the ruined tower of Biscoft, an undulating single note that would roll across the valley on cool autumn evenings. Then, nothing. Brox looked around. Had he missed a lever that needed pulling? A button to push? A dial to reset? Maybe the years had taken their toll on the time shifter, making it non-functioning. He sat there for several moments. Nothing happened. He started to undo the buckle on one of the belts. Then, the cage began to glow a faint green, building in intensity. A moment later, Brox heard a soft click and the cage began to rise. Brox could see a chain extending from the bottom of the cage to a spool of impossible size with countless miles of more chain attached to it. The cage continued to pick up speed until it raced upward toward the rotunda. When it reached the rotunda, it did not slam into it, but it passed through it as though it were made of smoke. When he looked back down, he could see the rotunda untouched, and he could see the chain continuing to follow. Higher and higher the cage raced, giving Brox an aerial view of splendid magnitude. He saw the manor, a caravan of merchants, cornfields, a river. He noticed something wrong with the river, the water was flowing. Upstream, whispered Brox. He looked back at the merchants and saw the caravan slowly going backwards. As he continued to gain altitude, he noticed that a gaggle of geese flew backwards. Then he saw the sun, racing from the west to the east. The whole world had a retrograde spin. He watched the geography change to a younger state, oxbow lakes reattached themselves to rivers and forests lost their second growth, becoming sparse. He could see history in reverse: cities shrank to towns, towns shrank to villages, villages shrank to farms, and farms shrank back to unexplored wilderness. Eventually, the world quit spinning backwards and resumed its normal movement. At that time, the chain at the bottom of the cage went taut, and Brox felt yanked back down toward the earth. To Brox's horror, he could see that the chain was pulling him into a heavily wooded forest filled with pine trees of old age and substantial in size. At his current speed, he would be killed on impact, despite being strapped in with a safety harness. However, like the rotunda, he and the cage passed through the branches and trunks as smooth as passing through fog. In the end, the cage carefully set down on the ground, its metal door popping open in the process. Brox wasted no time sitting, for Cloak Toff had warned him that the time shifter had just a notch under an hour before the magic waned, and the cage would be recalled with or without its occupant. Unbuckling the leather harness straps, he made his way out of the cage and toward a light that he had seen just before the cage had landed. The pine forest looked like any other pine forest, the branches of the conifers weaving together to form a haven for the animals that lived in the canopy and understory. Yet, he sensed something very wrong. As he walked in the midst of the trunks of the trees, he saw things that he did not approve of: chunks of spotty, wilted fronds on ferns and sickly black fiddleheads. Many mushrooms had poor-looking stalks and gills and had waxy limpid caps that felt like gummy slime when touched. He saw a small patch of beans growing in a clearing. Brox felt mildly astonished to find such plants growing in this area. When he stopped to investigate this anomaly, he instantly turned disgusted. The cotyledons were actually sinuous worms. One of the bean plants had been ripped out of the ground. Brox found that its roots were, in reality, shells of decaying beetles. In a small pond, he saw lilies that turned out to be planarians and other flat worms. Clumped together. The entire sight proved grotesque in nature, making him want to run away. A pair of raccoons lay nestled in some bushes, their eyes glowing a deep, unnatural red in a perpetual unmoving stare. The front half of their bodies had shriveled, dried, and mummified, while the back half had decomposed into rotting bones. Brox could feel a troubling, bone-chilling, sinister presence in the forest. He knew that this presence was responsible for the corrupted, tainted, quash plants and the jarring, grievous manner in which the raccoons had decayed. He noticed one other thing out of place in this forest: the closer he moved toward the light, the darker it grew outside. When he had landed, he had seen an afternoon Sunday. Yet now, the sky appeared as dim as twilight, and up ahead it appeared to be as black and forlorn as midnight. This darkness, this palpable, awkward darkness bothered him the most. It felt, how could he describe it, heavy, malicious, even loathsome in nature. Brox continued to move toward the light, hiking through wet whipping leaves. At least he hoped that they were leaves and not bugs. While trotting away from a stick that he had stepped on, which turned out to be a gelatinous mass of worms, ticks, and ground-up grasshoppers, he abruptly reached the edge of the woods. He simply gasped. In front of him, he gazed upon a valley where stood dozens of pyramids and ziggurats, their immaculately cut stones rising upward in the light of a plethora of watchfires. Around them prevailed scores of mausoleums, crafted with carvings of bones, skulls, gargoyles, and images of dread that he could not describe. Occasionally, a burial mound could be seen clustered between the structures. Then there were the grave markers. Tens of thousands of them, sometimes running in long symmetrical rows, other times in small clusters or pockets, and on a few occasions, a solitary grave marker could be found far from the others. These grave markers came in every design and size, ranging from nothing more than a stone in the ground with a name crudely chiseled in it to an elaborate effigy rising dozens of feet into the air, showing carved scenes from the deceased's life and listing important events of the person's days among the living. The entire valley floor was filled with an endless parade of these markers. In a pit, not more than 50 feet from Brox, he saw the bones of an undead dragon, waiting to serve some powerful master during a full moon or a new moon. Fortunately, the moon tonight was waxing crescent. The gnome knew instinctively that only a lich such as the Shaden Morg could command such a gruesome creature. He saw no movement in the valley. Everything looks completely still, as though it were dead. Brox chuckled at the irony of this last thought, but doing so made him feel nervous. Taking a couple more steps toward the edge of the cliff that overlooked the valley, he stood there before this overwhelming sight, wondering where he would find the Shaden Morg hiding the phylactery. Cloak Toff's note had told him that at this time and location the phylactery would be discovered, but Brox had overwhelming doubts. Cloak Toff had told him that the phylactery would have a death head with an archaic smile on it. Should he wander up and down the rows of grave markers, looking for a death head with an archaic smile on it? Should he examine the mausoleums, looking for a death head with an archaic smile on it? Perhaps he should explore the hidden passages of the pyramids and ziggurats looking for a death head with an archaic smile on it. This certainly was not going as he had anticipated. He looked around for some type of clue as to where he should begin. Almost immediately, he had an answer. He saw several graveyards that had iron fences or stone walls around them. One in particular appeared, basically speaking, empty. He examined it more closely. A stone wall with 2 iron gates, one at each end, encompassed a bare plot of ground. He did not see any tombstones, headstones, or gravestones, nor did he see any sarcophagi. He noted, however, a little mausoleum that looked like it had just finished being constructed. The name on it said Agewood. Besides the mausoleum, the only complete structure on the barren ground was a small tool shed with some shovels resting neatly along one side. In front of the door sat a bag. He squinted to see what was in the bag. It looked like some type of seeds. Carnations. Encouraged by this turn of events, he entered the valley, almost skipping down the side of the slope. When he reached the gate of what was obviously the Dara cemetery, Brox found himself very hesitant to enter as he reflected upon the nightmare experience he had already had here. Ignoring the urge to run back to the time shifter, Brox pushed open the gate, entered the cemetery, and made his way to the mausoleum where he saw a burning candle inside. For good measure, he picked up one of the shovels leaning next to the tool shed, because he had no weapon with him. The last time he even saw his dirk, the gal had been wrestling with it. Brox stopped about 10 paces away from the mausoleum. Inside he saw a figure dressed in some type of grey ceremonial robe. The portcullis to the mausoleum was closed, giving Brox a small sense of security that whoever was inside would not be able to turn around and charge him outright. Brox just stood and watched as the grey-cloaked figure went through a series of motions. The figure walked around 4 open caskets made from polished stone, examining a series of high-relief letters in straight columns that had been chiseled into the insides of the lids. The letters had flecks of pale yellow paint, or, at least, Brox thought that they were paint. "That is an appropriate curse," said the figure as he ran a white-gloved hand over the letters. The individual inside of the mausoleum stood there for a long time, waiting for something. What he waited for, Brox had no idea. The gnome strained his ears in order to determine if the figure was speaking runic words, but all he could hear was the screeching sound of bats as they flew out of a hidden resting place in one of the ziggurats. In due time, the figure pulled out a large tome, a grueling, ghastly grimace of the Grim Reaper on its front cover. Due to something both sinister and skin-crawling about the tome, Brox had to look away from it for a moment, fixing his gaze momentarily on the top of a distant pyramid, then the tool shed, and then the grass in front of him. Brox did not know what the other did, but he felt a chill rise up from the damp, slippery, dew-covered grass and spread through his body. Brox's eyes went back to the individual. The grey-robed figure placed the book on a casket and opened a small chest made out of splintered wood and iron bands. The rusty hinges gave a screech, causing Brox to take a defensive step backwards as he felt like the small chest contained some creature that wanted to attack him. The figure walked about the mausoleum, smoothing out his cloak as he did so, and then he returned to the small chest. Brox watched as the white-gloved hands pulled out a glass mirror. The gnome remembered that a phylactery had to be something that could be carried and something that could be broken. "So, it's a mirror," whispered the gnome to himself. He took a couple of steps so that he could get a better look at it, hoping to find a telltale sign that set the mirror apart from other mirrors. It looked rectangular in shape, maybe about 1 foot by 1.5 feet in size. The edges were tapered and the ends were rounded off. These were not telltale signs. When he saw the surface, he saw something that set this mirror apart from all others, a death skull with an archaic smile etched into its surface, just as the note from Cloak Toff had stated. Brox, now that he had found what he had sought, started to turn and leave, but he restrained himself. He wanted to know which stone casket the glass mirror would be placed in. The grey-cloaked figure set the phylactery in the top right stone casket and shut the lid. Again, Brox started to leave, but he saw the white gloves reach into the small chest another time and pull out a ceramic figurine of a snow-capped mountain painted greyish-brown with white at the top. Etched into the side of the mountain appeared a death skull with an archaic smile. Now, Brox felt confused. Which one was the phylactery? The individual placed this into the bottom left coffin and shut the lid. Brox decided to wait and see if the grey-cloaked figure would pull something else out of the small chest. Sure enough, the white-gloved hands reached in and pulled out a bone dagger. It, too, met the criteria for being the phylactery, easy to carry and breakable. Moreover, it had a death skull with an archaic smile on it. After he had placed this inside of the top right casket, he shut the lid, reached into the small chest, and pulled out a fourth item, an easy-to-carry, breakable crystal cup with a death skull and an archaic smile etched into the side. The grey-cloaked figure placed this item into the last stone coffin. Finally, this lid was closed, too. Brox waited to see if another item was forthcoming, but the white-gloved hand shut the small chest. There followed only silence coming from the mausoleum, and the candle inside simply flickered uncertainly as if someone wished to blow it out. The individual in the mausoleum, if he ever noticed Brox, made no attempt to deal with him. The gnome, having seen enough, slipped back toward the gate. He had intentionally left the gate open. But, now, he found it shut and locked. How it had gotten shut, and how it had gotten locked was beyond him. He started to climb the gate when he noticed the faint glow of a Wraith Revenge spell cast on it, a spell that temporarily drained the victim of his energy and left him desperately weak. Yet, worse than this spell, Brox heard a voice. "Ah, a guest." The voice sounded sarcastic. "Allow me to welcome you." The grey-cloaked figure bowed deeply. "May I personally introduce you to your final resting place?" Brox turned around to see the grey-cloaked figure standing behind him. The hood hid the face too well for Brox to make it out, but the bitter chill that emanated from the individual led Brox to determine that he stood before the lick. Since the phylactery must be hidden within a day of being made, Brox had guessed that this had to be the first day for the undead creature. Since this was not an ancient lick, Brox reasoned that it might be more vulnerable at the present. With that thought, Brox smashed the creature in the face with the shovel. The Shaden Morg did not even try to dodge the attack. A white glove snatched the shovel from the gnome and snapped it in two as if it were a twig. Brox did not press the attack. Instead, he ran past the tool shed, grabbing a sledgehammer on the way. He knew that the other gate would be locked, and that he would have to break down the wall with the tool. Moreover, he knew exactly where to break it down, where the mortar holding the bricks together looked thin and cracked. Returning to the place from which he had entered the cemetery that fateful evening 2 nights ago, he placed several solid hits against the wall, causing it to tumble. After dropping the sledgehammer, he passed through the breach, and a dozen paces later he glanced behind to get the position of the lick. The undead creature stood at the hole in the wall, unwilling, or unable, to step beyond the boundary of the graveyard. Brox found this unusual, because he thought that the lick would gladly move through the valley with its monuments marking the burying places of the dead. But they were all gone. Every pyramid, ziggurat, burial mound, mausoleum, and grave marker had ceased to exist. The entire valley had become empty of these countless monuments to the dead, save for the cemetery that he had just exited. He saw the cliff that he had climbed down, and he scrambled up it as quickly as he could. He desired only to return to the time shifter's cage. He glanced back at the Dara cemetery, seeing the grey-cloaked figure closing the portcullis on the mausoleum. After doing that, the Lik walked to the gate by the tool shed, took out a butterfly key, unlocked the padlock, and began to remove the chain attached to it. After the gate opened, the undead creature passed through it. Simultaneously, the cemetery shimmered, turned to fog, and rolled away in wisps. When the gnome re-entered the pine forest, he momentarily examined the trees and noticed that he could sense their pine needle-covered branches becoming rigid with an unnatural anxiety. Between the dark sky and some manipulation of chaos magic, his vision of the trees became distorted. One of the trees in front of him dissipated into something like a swarm of cicadas, pelting him in the face, leaving stinging welts. The air felt dark, a cold, soggy dark, like being stuck in a cellar without a lamp to light the way. Brox felt his movement impaired, a feeling that made him think that he ran on grass covered with thick layers of sticky syrup. Twice he felt someone throw a pitcher of ice-cold water on his face, but when he touched his face, it felt as dry as a baked brick. In desperation, he began to run in the direction of the time shifter. He tripped once on a gnarled root protruding out of the ground and crashed into a patch of short grasses. When he put his hands on the grass to push himself up, the grass blades turned out to be an innumerable number of night crawlers, their bodies being crushed under his hands, their innards squeezing between his fingers and getting under his fingernails. In the faint light, he could see that all of the pine trees were covered with yellow rot, powder rot, fungus rot, and other forms of corruption. He hit one tree and it simply broke in half, crashing down about him. The tree consisted only of a crown and bark, its internal hardwood long ago decomposed. He escaped injury from this falling tree by dropping to the ground in a small ravine. He saw a giant moss-covered boulder that he had passed when approaching the valley. When he reached the boulder, it began to quickly melt away like a stick of wax thrown into a roaring fireplace, turning into a grayish-green globule that started to take on a familiar shape, the shape of his face. Instinctively, he knew what was going to happen. The globule would continue to take on his appearance until it mimicked him perfectly. Then it would kill him and assume his role in life. Against his natural inclination, he jumped onto the globule, sticking to the unbelievably soft, mushy rock, and proceeded to stomp the forming face back into a shapeless mass of grayish-green. A new face began to form in a different spot, and he pounced on it, smashing it back into a splotch of rock. He had to do this several times before he noticed that the mass of grayish-green lost interest in mimicking him and started to return to the shape of a boulder. A voice began to call his name in a mumbled, garbled, scratchy sound. The sound became more and more clear. He turned around to see someone approaching him. The person's form appeared indistinct at first. A moment later, he recognized her. Tralinda? He wondered how she had arrived here. Could there be another time shifter? Did she somehow manage to hold onto the cage and ride out with him? Did she? He suddenly got the strange sense that the individual was a mockery. "You're not really Tralinda." "No, I am not," said the image of the brownie. "But you need to come back with me to the Shaden morgue." "I will not go back with you. If you come with me now, then my master will reward you with a position in his hierarchy. A position of power and long life." "You mean a life of being undead? A state of bitter remorse?" Brox did not wait to see what the other had to say. He simply turned and ran. In the distance, he saw the cage of the time shifter. Jumping over a log, he pressed on with all haste. A vine reached down and grabbed him, pulling him off balance. As he fell, the vine snapped, making a sound like a child screaming in pain. His feet hit the ground in rapid succession while things reached up from the ground to trip him, and others dropped from branches, sticking to him like little weights, quickly accumulating in heaviness. He began to frantically pull off the weights, shredding his jacket in the process. When he reached the cage, he bounded in head first. Hurriedly, he slammed the door shut. Outside of the cage he could see more and more individuals: Tralinda, Thistlethorn, Cavington the Bee-Headed, Cinderhop, Cumulonimbus the Thunderhead, and others that he had talked to since he had read the Moonscript. Each one called his name and beckoned him to come serve the master. Brox ignored them and pulled on the time shifter's only silver lever, the one that sent the cage back to its true time and home. The cage began to rise and the individuals charged, attempting to catch it before it got too high. Those representing Tralinda and Thistlethorn were too short to reach the cage, and the impostors of Cavington the Bee-Headed and Cinderhop moved too slowly. However, the giant pretender proved different. After a few great leaps, he drew a massive club that had been strapped to his back and swung it at the cage. Brox reflexively ducked as the wood of the club made contact with the metal of the cage. In spite of this, the weapon just passed harmlessly through the time shifter. Time began to speed up, racing through decades in seconds and centuries in minutes. After watching a wilderness being converted into a farm, then a village, a town, and finally a city, Brox felt the chain begin to pull the cage downward. Even though he knew by experience that the cage would pass through the roof of the rotunda without harm, he still gripped a pair of levers, bracing for impact. Brox could see the huge spindle of chain spinning rapidly, pulling the cage at a tremendous speed. With perfect timing, the cage landed on the time shifter's base, and the spindle came to a complete stop. There followed a green flare of energy that dissipated into the 4 dilator rods. Brox collapsed forward, exhaustion filling his body. The physical drain of the round trip was a normal byproduct of time travel. He looked over to his right where he could see Tralinda and a pair of brownies. One of them rang a small brass bell to let the others know that Brox's trip had ended. "It appears that you have returned." Tralinda's voice sounded calm but had traces of relief. "Appears?" asked Brox, keeping his head down on a set of dials. "To us it appears that you have been sitting in the cage the entire time, spinning dials, pulling levers, and pushing buttons. As we saw it, you have always been here. We saw everything that you did. For example, when you wanted to run you would pull a lever. When you would pick something up, you would push a button. When you would see something fearful, you would spin certain dials. And you must have seen some terrifying sights since a number of times you spun several dials as far as they would go. However, from your point of view you were in the past walking around, interacting with the environment." She started to explain more but simply said, "It's just a paradox caused by time travel. It was an unusual hour for me." She smiled at this. "About an hour from your perspective. In truth, you were gone for 6 days. 6 days. Another irony of time travel." She looked at him in his weakened state, blinking. "That is part of the reason you feel weak. It's like going 6 days without a meal. Time travel is an uncertain science. One cannot be sure how long one will be gone, but 3 to 8 days is normal." Brox released the latch on the cage and stepped out, his knees shaky but strong enough to carry him. At the same time several brownies arrived, one pushing a chair, 2 more pushing a cart with food on it. After a mere 4 or 5 steps, Brox collapsed into the chair. The brownies rolled the cart of food to him. Tralinda stepped behind him and tied a napkin around his neck, for such happened to be the custom of brownies when they ate. Within a matter of moments, he found himself eating a full meal of twice stewed carrots, piquant sauce, sour boar jerky, cool beads, a variety of legumes, and for dessert, 7-berry pie. To drink, they served him something called Traveler Elixir, a magical beverage designed specially by Cloaktoff to replenish lost energy after traveling through time. The brownies had found a formula for it and had brewed a batch for Brox. After completing the meal and imbibing the Traveler Elixir, Brox felt mostly normal. By his time frame, he had only been awake for 3 hours, and he now stepped back into that time schedule. He specifically noted that he did not feel tired, whether due to the Traveler Elixir or another paradox from time travel, he could not tell. Later, Tralinda led him to a small chamber where a tremendously old brownie rested on a flat couch. Age cracks, too numerous to comprehend, lined his face. To Brox, the brownie looked dead. A heavy, thick, yellow and brown plaid blanket covered him to his neck. "This is Pav Milmore, elder of the Broomsticks." Tralinda's voice sounded extremely respectful. "He has watched over this clan ever since I was a youth." Brock studied the elder's face, noting the incredible age. "How old is he?" "We are not sure. However, he is the last living member of the Broomsticks to have seen Cloak Toff. He was still a child on that ill-fated day when Cloak Toff used the time shifter. He says he remembers his mother helping him polish the Chronomancer's boots before he left on his time-traveling trip. That would make him over a century old." Brox raised his eyebrows, being amazed at the elder's age. "How old," asked Brox suddenly, "was Cloak Toff when he time-traveled?" She pondered that for a moment. "A middle-aged man. Maybe 40. But wouldn't that mean he is well in excess of 140 at present?" "We cannot tell. Remember that you felt like you had been gone only about an hour, but 6 days had passed for us. It may very well be that he has only aged a couple of years. To him, he has only been gone for a short period of time." Brox turned this paradox over in his mind. After a moment of this, he nodded his head and simply accepted it as one of those time-traveling concepts of "that's how things work." Tralinda said something in the language of the brownies. The ancient elder opened his eyes and turned to look at her. At that time, Brox could see that his eyes were pale, a sure sign of partial or complete blindness. He said a single word, and Tralinda moved into action, fetching him something to drink, a type of peppermint juice. After a few drinks, Pav Milmore spoke again in the language of the brownies. Tralinda turned to Brox and interpreted the words of the elder. "He says that you need to continue your endeavor to find the..." She stopped and looked at the old brownie. Then she stared hard at Brox. Worry, concern, and fear showed on her face. "Lick?" Brox nodded slowly. He watched her shiver as a chill ran up her spine. She licked her lips and continued. "The lick will engage in the marshalling of the undead at the next new moon." 10 days, mused Brox in a low voice. 4 days, she noted. "You were gone 6. "Of course," agreed Brox. The aged brownie spoke again. "You are to travel to Doughty, Berwick, and Graben, which is to say, to the realm of Sedu." Brox shook his head. "It's too far a distance to be covered in 4 days." Tralinda said something in the brownie language to the elder resting on the couch. He replied in raspy tones, rolled over onto his side, closed his eyes, and went to sleep. Tralinda checked to make sure that he was comfortable and escorted Brox out of the chamber and into the hallway. She rehearsed the words of the old brownie to herself before translating them. "He said that there is a farmhouse made of stained birch wood that is located in the plains of Claystone near the Four-Pillar Junction." Brox nodded his head in acknowledgement that he knew the place. She proceeded. "In its cellar is a vaulted door that leads to Crosdown World." Crosdown World. Brox knew this as a dungeon that had defied adventurers for scores of years. A dungeon of doom. A dungeon of destruction. A dungeon of destitution. A dungeon of despair. A dungeon of death. Children would tell tales of the Crosdown World to their friends to instill fanatical fear, brusque burdens, ponderous panic, scurrilous sickness, and lonesome loathing. Its entrances eventually became forgotten, and its tales had been passed on as legends of wheeling wretched woe. "Somewhere," she went on, "there is a wall. If you touch it, it will teleport you to the realm of Sedu." After she finished speaking, she folded her hands and waited for his response. Brox looked absently at the smooth granite stone wall behind Tralinda for several moments before speaking. "Where in Crosdown World is this wall?" He did not say. "Can you go ask him?" "No." She blinked. "He has gone into a brownie sleep. You cannot easily wake one out of a brownie sleep. Moreover, at his age, he could be in the sleep for several days. He only wakes up for a few hours each week." She took him by the arm and escorted him, walking down a long hallway containing 3 paintings, one of each of Cloak Toff's parents and one of his younger sister. He did not have time to study the paintings in detail, but he did read each caption. Ricoeur Toff, the 26th of June 1190 to the 24th of April 1260, Honorable Judicious Judge of the High Court. Bell Toff, the 11th of June 1198 to the 15th of January 1263, Caretaker of the Archduke's Royal Garden. Thara Toff, the 27th of March 1228 to the 27th of March 1251, Renaissance girl, petrified by a basilisk. Turned to stone on her birthday, asked Brox. Yes. A true tragedy. There existed a hint of sadness in Tralinda's voice. When I hear the story, it still brings tears to my eyes. In short, Thara took a basket of steaming bread and cheese chunks from her mother to her father. The path she took ran along the dusty road. A basilisk had wandered up from the swamps where it encountered her and used its gaze attack upon her. They found the petrified girl that evening. Brox and Tralinda exited the hallway through a door that led outside to a well-kept stable. The gnome could see some horses grazing in a wide pasture filled with tall grasses. We have prepared a miniature mule troika for you. Tralinda opened a short side door, so short that Brox had to duck to enter. The troika will take you to the plains of Claystone, then they will turn around and return here. Brox had seen horse troikas but never a miniature mule troika. Standing before him were 3 miniature mules connected to harnesses that pulled a small cart. One of the miniature mules stood at the front, then 2 of the other animals, and finally a small cart. The miniature mules had green and brown plaid braids worked into their manes and yellow and brown plaid cuffs on their hooves. 2 brownies buzzed around the miniature mules, brushing them down. A third brownie placed a small sack of victuals into the back of the cart. We do hope that you return to us in due season, said Tralinda, blinking once. Without waiting for Brox to make a parting comment, she and the other brownies disappeared through their ability to become invisible. Brox could see their footprints being laid down as they all filed out the short door. Brox, left alone, climbed up into the cart, took the reins, and gave them a tug. The 3 miniature mules moved into action, making their way toward the plains of Claystone.